webcast, and they will be webcasting, I think, all of our lectures or programs in this series. So we want to thank the people from CPIT for doing that. Another point also has to do with the web is that we are in the process of putting up from the archives, putting up letters and documents relating to the Bishop's program for social reconstruction in 1919, also text and other kinds of material that could be useful in teaching kind of Catholic social justice. A number of people, David and Brian both mentioned a great deal about John A. Ryan, and he was kind of a figure in the Bishop's program, and so there's a lot of material. And we have other material on the archives website having to do teaching material, documents, and other kinds of material having to do with John Ryan's commitment to social justice, his thoughts about it, and the Catholic Church's response to industrialization in the early 20th century, at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. But just to let you know. For this afternoon session, I'm going to I've asked Professor Leslie Tentler from the History Department here at Catholic University to act as the moderator and to introduce our speakers. Leslie.
Well, I do welcome you to this second session, which has to do with the impact of the 1986 Pastoral on Economic Justice. Our panelists bring us an impressive expertise, so I'm going to introduce them very briefly. It's far more important to hear what they have to say than to hear me recite from their very long and impressive CVs. I will introduce them in the order in which they appear in the program, which I assume is the order in which they're going to speak. Jennifer Moss-Weigert is director of what I think is the brand new Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching and Service at Georgetown University. She is also research professor in both the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and the program on Social Justice and Peace. She comes to Georgetown from Notre Dame, where, apart from having had a career there, she also received her PhD in sociology. Among her many publications is the co-authored and prize-winning The Search for Common Ground, What Unites and Divides Catholic Americans. Bill D'Antonio, also a sociologist, is currently affiliated with Catholic University's Life Cycle Institute, to which he came after a long career at Notre Dame and the University of Connecticut. He has published numerous books and articles on various aspects of American religion, particularly the changing attitudes of the Catholic laity. Thank goodness someone is interested. And he asked me, please, to remind you, or let you know, I guess, that the next volume in a remarkable series, a longitudinal study of Catholic lay attitudes, is due out in just a few weeks. That is called American Catholics Today, New Realities of Their Faith and Their Church. Many of you may also have heard him a few weeks back sounding very authoritative indeed on National Public Radio. Joseph Capizzi teaches moral theology and ethics at Catholic University. He, too, earned his PhD at the University of Notre Dame. There seems to be a theme running through this panel. And has already published articles in venues as diverse as Communio and the Journal of Church and State. So, without further ado.
I have to begin with, Jennifer's a lovely name, but my first name is Kathleen, just for those of you. I don't know, I do like that name, but thank you. It's really nice to be here. What I want to do is, I'm a Trinitarian, as I'm sure you figured out Brian Hare is, and his wonderful array of things. I want to talk a bit about the Catholic students and students at Catholic colleges and universities as what are we doing about the Bishop's Economic Pastoral? Where are they? What have they been doing? Where are we going? Secondly, I want to look at a particular document that I think has helped change what's going on, what can go on, what is going on. And David O'Brien had something to do with that, so there's a little tie-in with the previous presentations. And then I want to talk about going forward. What does it mean for us in Catholic higher education in particular at colleges where some of us are now located. So let me begin with, I want to tell you about 3 studies that give us some data about students. One of them I was privileged to be part of in 1994. A group of us wanted to have a sense of where our Catholic students on Catholic colleges and universities on the social teachings, on the social mission of the church. So we invited the 200 Catholic colleges and universities to participate in what's called an annual survey where you can add questions at the end. We added 20 questions to the end of that document, and of the schools that participated, and by the time we went through all this good stuff, we had 7,000 students who filled out the instrument from 24 of our Catholic colleges and universities. One of the things to note about this group is people worried about, this was the 90s, were students less religious, more religious, what weren't they doing? Bill will talk a lot about the national data, but in this particular group, 85% of them were attending church with some regularity. Only 15% said they never go to church. 55% prayed or meditated at least once a week. 3/4 of them indicated they plan to be involved in religious congregations upon graduation. One item that's of particular relevance to our conversation about the economic pastoral is this one. It is the church's business to help believers form their consciences on the moral dimensions of economic decision-making. I could ask you if you agree or disagree, but I'm not going to ask you. I'm going to tell you what they said. It was a 3-way toss-up. 30% disagreed with the statement, 38% were undecided, and 32% agreed. Now, we created a number of indices out of those 20 questions and tried to look at what was the relationship between students' interest and action in volunteerism, social action writ large, the religious behavior and practices. When it comes to things like service and social action, the data are pretty clear at the national level. Students have been increasingly involved in what most people would call community service. In this group in the 90s, 75% of them were involved. There was a positive, moderate relationship between involvement in religious practices and involvement in service activities. But, and this is the but, almost no relationship between the orientation to social action and their engagement in Catholic beliefs and practices. And the social action were some of the big items, influencing political structures. How important is that? Getting involved in environmental campaigns, participating in community action, and promoting racial understanding. So almost no link between that action and their religious beliefs. I wrote this up with a colleague of mine. It's in the ACCU bulletin. Happy to give you references to it. One of the comments we wrote after making the statement I just did to you is this. Is it reasonable to say that something is awry in their understanding of the link between church teachings, religious practice, and social action? So that was the first of the resources I want to tell you about. 1994, seniors in Catholic colleges and universities, active and engaged, religious, doing good things, not a lot of link between their social political action and their thinking about religious beliefs and their practices in that arena. Second has to do with first-year students. Now, some of you would know that one of the great resources of data on incoming and graduating seniors, and in fact on alums now, is the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA. They have been gathering data on incoming first-year students since 1966, so some really terrific trend analysis is available for those of you who would like it. They do an incoming first-year survey in the fall, and I have some data just from the 2005. The 2006 data has just come out, but I didn't have access to it, so you have to go with the 2005. These data come from over 263,000 students at 385 different four-year colleges and universities, and it's statistically adjusted to reflect the responses of the 1.3 million first-time, full-time entering students. Overall, we know there's a rise in attitudes reflecting social concern and civic responsibility. Now, partly this is, you will recall, a reflection of the worst global and national disasters in their lifetime, the tsunami and then the hurricanes in the Gulf. Nevertheless, it is the case that there's a stronger commitment to getting involved and to being aware of those things. When you look at students in Catholic colleges versus students in all four-year colleges, the good news is there's a little bit of a difference. The other news is there's not a lot of difference as they come to us in their attitudes. But let me tell you, the students in Catholic colleges and universities on the following items score more highly. They're more supportive of these ideas than the students in all four-year colleges. Influencing social action, raising a family, being well off financially. By the way, those are almost always the top two in the survey for everybody. Helping those who are in difficulty, participating in community action program, and keeping up to date with political affairs. They have lower percentages in two areas that some people would say are pretty relevant: becoming involved in programs to clean up the environment and helping to promote racial understanding. So if you just looked at incoming students in the fall of 2005, not a lot of difference in the groups, but slightly higher percentages of students coming to Catholic schools in the items that I mentioned to you. There's a third resource that I think is getting much more play now, again, coming out of HARI, the Higher Education Research Institute. They decided that the issue of spiritual life of students was not getting the attention it needed, and so they launched in the fall of 2004 a study. And they have a survey of 112,000 plus entering first-year students, again, large sample at 236 colleges or universities. Now, first comment just to make is, in my own experience, one of the big distinctions that has come into the vocabulary of college students in the last 15 to 20 years is, I'm spiritual but not religious. It's kind of this motion with their hands, I'm spiritual, not religious. And I think we have to keep unpacking that, but and I will talk a little bit about it later, but part of that is there's some hunger of some kind in the culture for what we would call spirituality. There's less excitement about the religion as an organization, and I think the last couple of questions to the previous speakers really get at this. You look at the tenor of the times, and at least for our church, there are a lot of challenges that have come out of the clerical abuse scandal that just exacerbate, I think, the situation of people thinking institutions are good and you ought to get involved and put your oar in the water with them. Having said that, in this particular study, on issues such as abortion, legalization of marijuana, casual sex, those who are highly engaged religiously are much less likely to support keeping abortion legal, engaging in casual sex, legalizing marijuana. Nevertheless, because some people think, okay, that's what conservatives do and they don't do the other stuff, religiously engaged and to a lesser extent highly spiritual students take positions such as supporting affirmative action and opposing the death penalty. So it's not this, there's one little group over here, one little group over here, the conservatives and liberals. There's some crossing over in support for different items depending on the person's putting together that package. What is a little disconcerting for those of us who are Catholic is that Roman Catholics, in this particular survey on spirituality in college students, Roman Catholics tend to score below the overall average on religious commitment, religious engagement, religious social conservatism, and religious skepticism. Now, those are three almost vignettes, but they are from national studies that give us some flavor for college students and their ideas about religion, engagement, and spiritual things, and their involvement in the larger political social arena, which is it's certainly what the economic pastoral and the peace pastoral as well were promoting. Okay, with that, let me see what is helping or what has moved into the I think arena to help us as educators think about what we might do with our students. Well, one key resource is that in 1995, the bishops of the church established a task force, and Dave O'Brien was on this task force, to assess where are we in Catholic social teachings, what are we doing, what can we be doing. And this is a direct quote from the document, which I'm going to share with you in a second. This initiative reflects the bishop's conviction that the social mission of the church is central to the overall mission of the church and integral to the faith of every Catholic. A key to deepening the Catholic community's understanding of this social mission is integrating it fully and effectively in Catholic educational and catechetical programs. This is the document called Sharing Catholic Social Teaching Challenges and Directions, which came out then in 1998 with two parts, the bishop's reflections on the assessment and then the task force report as well. It's a terrific document. If you're not familiar with it, I would really encourage you to get it. A number of things resulted with that document, I think, are directly affected because of it. One of them is something that Dave and I have been involved in for a long time. The Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities established the Advisory Committee on Peace and Justice Education. And over the years, it's done a variety of things, but since 2001, we have been offering what we call the Higher Education Wraparound with Catholic Campaign for Human Development, CRS, and the USCCB's Social Development and World Peace, a wraparound to the annual social ministry gathering, which is coming this very weekend. So our gathering, the Higher Ed, starts tonight with a dinner, and then all day tomorrow and on Sunday. The theme last year was the Economic Justice for All Pastoral. It was the 20th anniversary, and we were looking at it, so we called it the Unfinished Agenda. The keynote was Jim Hugg from the Center of Concern, and some of you would know his wonderful wit. He opened his comments with this quip, "Tell me, which part was finished?" Not a lot. So we had a good conversation about there's a lot of work for all of us to do. One of the resources, again, from that document, cards were made to try to get themes out to the larger audiences, certainly in Catholic colleges and universities. The 7 themes as identified in the Catholic Social Teaching document. Now, a lot of people count differently, discuss differently, but it was that kind of a resource that enabled a lot of people on colleges, campuses, to be able to say, here, let's have conversations about what this tradition is and how you might engage and be involved in it. Somewhat self-servingly, but nevertheless, because I don't get a cent from it, I want to tell you that this book that I co-edited with Alexia Kelly called Living the Catholic Social Tradition, Cases and Commentary was a direct result. I mean, we recognized over the years there simply are not enough resources for Catholic colleges and universities or seminaries or Newman centers on state campuses to help people understand what does it mean to translate abstract, natural law, if you want, even biblical ideas into everyday life. What does it mean? We used a case method, hired some graduate students, some young adults to help us interview and document a variety of good experiences that were happening in Catholic social tradition around the country. If you do buy it, the receipts go to the CCHD and to the center I'm privileged to direct, so I really am happy if you would like to get one. Nevertheless, it was a direct result of the work that had come out of that document, Sharing Catholic Social Teaching. There are other resources, and I have a sheet that I'm happy to give to you afterwards that lists both websites and some of the books that have come in the last 5 to 10 years that are really terrific resources, is the only word I can keep thinking of, to help people learn more about it, to share it with students, to get something happening on campus. Everything from Charles Curran's Catholic Social Teaching 2002 book, Ken Himes' Modern Catholic Social Teaching, to the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, a variety of good resources. On the back of it, I just want to point out, one of the things that I have tried to do in my teaching over the years is to help students just understand concepts, and the Bishop's Economic Pastoral has a lovely section on justice, commutative, distributive, and social or contributive justice. I simply pull the material together on a one-page handout and use it as a conversation with students about what do you think justice means. And to my delight and joy, a lot of them have been benefited by this because it unpacks some of the different kinds of ways of thinking about justice. And it helps alleviate the concern of a number of students who get involved in what we would call community service, who feel like they are doing noblesse oblige, or they are helping those poor people who can't do a darn thing, and they start to feel a little squeamish about it. But when they look at social justice as contributive justice, as a vehicle for removing barriers so everyone can make a contribution to the common good, it's much more exciting, and it's much more affirming, and it's much less, I'm on a guilt trip. I'm on a trip to help others be able to get the resources they need to start to contribute to the common good. So I think that particular document influenced a lot of things, a lot of activities, a lot of resources, and those are still being used in order to get more people to understand the riches of this particular tradition. There are some organizations that have been referred to in the previous panel, and I just want to highlight them because they're wonderful resources. And there are 5. One is Network. Some of you would know it was founded by women religious back in 1971. It is still going strong. It's a Catholic leader in the global movement for justice and peace. I have been on the board. I am not right now. But it's still committed to a vision of global justice, economic and social justice. A variety of resources. Lobbying still is important. What has become more important over the years is collaboration with other organizations. I think that's one of the signs of the times. There are difficulties for individual organizations to keep sustaining a financial base. So part of this is how do we work together to make sure the work is done without each of us going after the same resources all the time. Network is one. Catholic Campaign for Human Development used to be called the Campaign for Human Development, but its name was changed a number of years back. Has some terrific resources on poverty. If you don't know about their Poverty Pulse survey they do each year, this is the 6th year, you can get some terrific data about Americans' attitudes about poverty, which is useful for all of us to think about, as many of us see a culture that doesn't exactly prize people in all ways. This helps us understand where the concerns are and what we can do about that. Third is the social ministry gathering. Some of you would know about this. Each year, Catholic Charities folk, social justice folk out in the diocese come to Washington to be updated on key issues in our world. Immigration or agriculture, the Farm Bill really does matter, so it's kind of cool to be talking about economic justice for all. And not just because I'm from Minnesota, but it's an important thing for all of us to care about. Lots of terrific resources. They have marvelous speakers, and then they lobby. They literally go to the Hill to meet with their representative to express the concerns about all of those issues and the hopes that legislation will be well crafted to meet the needs, especially of the most vulnerable. Fourth is Catholic Charities. Some of you would know they've started a new campaign to reduce poverty in America by 50% by the year 2020, calling all of us to get involved. You can go to their website, some great literature. The hope to create a movement that everybody will see as important and work on. And the 5th one is Interfaith Worker Justice. And I mentioned this one because it is ecumenical. It's an interfaith. It's not just Catholic. And it's headed up by a wonderfully dynamic Kim Bobo. Some of us probably got most engaged when Jack Egan celebrated his 80th birthday, and he sent notes to all of his friends saying, okay, for my 80th birthday, you're to give money to this group. It was then called the National Interfaith. So we all gave money, and we went to celebrate his great birthday, and we've all been involved ever since. The power of one person, as usual. And Jack was a dynamo, as you know. But this group, I think, especially appeals to students because it's not sectarian. And I want to use that word carefully and cautiously. Certainly my own experience on campuses, Notre Dame, now Georgetown in particular, the concern about pluralism, the concern about respecting others, the concern about tolerance is strong. And to have an umbrella that suggests faith matters, but it matters because lots of us share it, not because I am something, is real important. And that leads me to my final part about going forward, what happens from here. There's no doubt in my mind that we still need continuing education on the body of teachings and tradition at all levels. Parish, Catholic schools, CCD, you name it. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, which is another great resource if you're not on their website, in last August did a study, and one of the questions they ask is, does your clergy ever speak out on, and then they listed a set of items. So and now this isn't broken down by Catholics, it's just the national response. Hunger and poverty, 96% said yes. Abortion, 75%. Situation in Iraq, 51%. Environment, 45%. Death penalty, 41%. Immigration, 30%. Now, it excites me to think that hunger and poverty was the largest support of having heard their clergy speak about it. And I would tell you just about one resource because it's a colleague of mine. If your parish, your diocese have not been involved, Preaching the Just Word, which was founded by Walter Burghardt, the great Jesuit, is now headed up by Ray Kemp over at Georgetown to assist priests to more effectively preach biblical and social justice. So a resource to help in our diocese, our parishes, so that that level of expertise is increased. Now, I would also say some hopeful signs. If you look at high school, there's some study, a number of studies, but one, partly because I love CARA. Those of you who don't know about the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, this is a little plug for them. I don't get a cent from them, and it doesn't go to my center, so I want you to know that. But they, with the support of Catholic Relief Services and the National Catholic Education Association, did a study of Catholic high schools on Catholic social teaching. I'm not going to give you all the data. It's very positive, though. Principals in support, teachers in support, materials. There is a question of challenges, nevertheless, and several of them are these. There's a lack of time to do this kind of work. There are competing curricular requirements, lack of faculty knowledge, which again says how do we help people learn it, and the countercultural nature of the Catholic social tradition. I would add that only because I was asked to review it, I know that NCAA is coming out with a new manual for high school teachers to better integrate and understand Catholic social teaching. And I think we're just going to constantly need resources that speak to the signs of the times that people can engage and enjoy as they learn about what is still, as that book says, the best kept secret. On colleges and universities, I would say, for me, one of the exciting things, even though we were talking, where's Bill? We were talking a little bit about how strong, we aren't positive, but in the 20 years since John Howard Yoder and I started the undergraduate concentration in peace studies back at Notre Dame, 1983, we have had lots of programs on Catholic colleges and universities focusing on justice and peace, on poverty, on immigration, on human rights. I mean, you can literally go to Webb's and pull off wonderful resources in the area of justice, I would say, and economic justice in particular. And I'm happy to give some of that material to you if you'd like it. What I find probably exciting is that a lot of the efforts on campuses today are student-initiated. If you look at sweatshops, I know you're going to do something on living wage, Tim, later. I'm delighted to see that. If you look at socially responsible investments, it has been students who have pushed institutions, my own being one on the living wage, and some of you probably read the national reports. They weren't totally accurate. I'd be happy to give you my version of that reality. But it's exciting to me to think that students care deeply about these issues. Justice matters to them, economic well-being. I've invited a couple of students to join me on a panel at this higher education wraparound tomorrow. 2 from Georgetown will come and 2 from Villanova to talk about their efforts in fair trade and in the sweatshop work. The question is, this is back to the earlier, why are they doing it? Now, I want to say to you that Bill tells me there's a new study that's going to talk about some of the data on faith-filled people doing this out of a sense of faith. My own experience is that's a very small group. Most of the students are engaged in this have a paradigm that says, I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. This is what it means to be human, to care about others. Don't tell me I must do this because it's out of the faith. There's some connection there that they find reprehensible. It's as if it diminishes their desire to do good because it's supposed to be out of faith. I have a hard time with them on this conversation, I must say, because for me, the way it's framed is, my faith is so central that it's like spilling over, that it's the joy and the desire to have others be able to. So it doesn't feel like it's a command and a diminishment of my involvement. But I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people for whom this is a challenge. They want to do it because it's the right thing to do, period, not because of faith. So I think we have some challenges in that area. That they want to get involved is important. That we help them understand the tradition more so that they can take delight and use it, I think is important. So I'll tell you one personal story, and then I want to close with a quote from the document. I am the director of this wonderful place that was started in 2001 called the Center for Social Justice, Research, Teaching, and Service, but most kids call it the CSJ. We're working with Campus Ministry on a new series this spring on Catholic social teachings and tradition. And low-keyed, we invited a number of Catholic students, and we thought we'd get 5 or 6, 7, maybe if you're lucky. And I was to be the first speaker, which we thought we might get 2 or 3 then, depending on if they knew me at all. But much to our delight, we had about 25 students come, and we met in a dorm room, and we had a little brunch, and I gave them basically CST 101. The students who came out of Catholic schools had heard of it. The kids who came out of Jesuit schools, I say with joy, knew a lot about it. The kids who went to public high schools had no clue. Some of them had never heard it preached about, talked in a family, in any of their experience. So it was, in fact, a revelation to them. For those for whom it was a revelation, it was a positive revelation. It was kind of like, oh, wow, there is this thing. I never heard of it. What can I do? So I think we have a lot of work to do in trying to help students learn more about it, welcome them into the conversation. I think if David and Brian said anything, it's that there's some growth, there's some changes, the times do change. How do we respond to them? What can we do with them? With all of that, I want to end with this quotation from Economic Justice for All, paragraph 27. The pursuit of economic justice takes believers into the public arena, testing the policies of government by the principles of our teaching. We ask you to become more informed and active citizens, using your voices and votes to speak for the voiceless, to defend the poor and the vulnerable, and to advance the common good. We are called to shape a constituency of conscience, measuring every policy by how it touches the least, the lost, and the left out among us. This letter calls us to conversion and common action, to new forms of stewardship, service, and citizenship. That challenge seems even more compelling to me today than it was when the bishops wrote it, and the work we do, I think, all the more important. Thank you.
Well, Brian and David set the tone. They told us exactly how this economy pastoral came into being. And Kathleen gives us a glimpse of its possible future among young people. I have to say that as you talked about young people, I couldn't help but remember my experience in Italy of going to the Comunità di Sant'Egidio in the Trastevere in 1999 and again in 2004. Here we have a group of young people, the Young Turks back in 1968, who decided it was time to live the gospel and not wait for the bishops to lead them. And they have been leading them ever since. An extraordinary group. They're now 30,000 strong and worldwide. Kathleen, if you help match that here, we will be in your debt. Now, I'm going to present some research findings from several different sources to provide an overview of how American Catholics in different settings have responded to the Catholic Church's teachings on social justice. And I'm going to be talking mainly about research that I've been doing with my colleagues. In 1987, my colleagues Dean Hoagie, Jim Davidson, and Ruth Wallace and I were embarking on the first what has turned out to be now 4-volume series on American Catholics. Now, this was 1987 in the spring. We took into account that the peace and economy pastorals had been produced in the prior 4 years, 1983 and 1986 respectively, and we decided it would be important to learn how American Catholics had reacted to these letters for the bishops. We know that Protestant leaders, Jewish leaders, American leaders, generally with some hiccups from the right, had responded very positively, and we wanted to see how the laity had responded. So we included a question in our we included 2 questions, one on the peace pastoral, one on the economy pastoral, and our question was this on the economy pastoral, quote, in 1986, the American bishops issued a pastoral letter calling for changes in the U.S. economy. Have you heard or read about this letter? Well, 1 in 4 Catholics in the national survey said they had either heard or even read about it. Not surprisingly, people in business and management were somewhat less enthusiastic than the people in the working labor unions, but actually 71% of the overall sample said they were in general agreement with its findings. Now, in our second survey, in 1993, heartened by the thought that by then hordes would have heard about and would be acting upon the pastoral, we decided to ask the question again. Well, in 1993, 19% of American Catholics said they recalled something about or had actually read parts of the pastoral. And we decided not to ask the question in 1999. So we have some sense that a small portion of the Catholic laity was aware of the pastoral at 2 points in time. Now, in our 4 surveys, we have tried to monitor in a number of ways parts of this question of social justice. In one case, we've used a series of questions about what it takes to be a good Catholic. Those of you who are old enough remember it used to be important to have people say you were or were striving to be a good Catholic. So the question with regard to social justice that we asked and have asked over the 4 surveys is, can a person be a good Catholic without donating time or money to help the poor? Straight out. The 4 responses over time are as follows. The percent agreeing that you can be a good Catholic without donating time or money to help the poor. In 1987, 46%, just under half, said you could be. By 1993, 52% said you could be a good Catholic, a little uptick there. 1999, it was 56%. But lo and behold, in 2005, it was down to 44%. Now, it's hard to know exactly what happened in 2005, but certainly one of the things that happened in 2005 is that these millennial young Catholics that Kathleen's talking about are now in our sample, and they might have had some impact, and we can anticipate that if their responses continue as they were in our 2005 sample, that we will have a continuing growth of this new young generation that we have called the millennials, responding that you cannot be a good Catholic unless you donate time and money or money to help the needy. In the 2005 and 1999, we also had a number of other questions which we asked that are relevant here. I want to bring in one. Now, we have created an index which we call commitment index. It's a commitment to the church as institutional church. Our 3 variables to measure commitment are that people in a high commitment level are those who go to Mass every Sunday, who say they go to Mass every Sunday, who say that they would never leave the church, and who say that the church is among the most important parts of their life. We put them together as an index, and it looks and has been rather steady and consistent over time. And for us, at least, it is the best indicator we have of commitment to the institutional church. And then we try to relate it to other variables like a commitment to donating time or money to help the poor. Well, in the first place, you'll be interested to know that in the first of our surveys, in 87, 27% of American Catholics ended up in the high commitment category. By 2005, we're down to 21%. Now, there are a number of variables. I won't go into any depth, but the highest percentage of, proportionately, pre-Vatican II Catholics of my age are most often found in the high commitment level, and the Vatican II and post-Vatican II, and now the millennials, are found in medium and low commitment levels. And the problem with that figure, of course, is that we're dying and we're not being replaced. And so it's difficult for us to anticipate the percentage of highly committed rising soon unless there are not enough church leaders here. You decide to clone us, and I'd be happy to be among the first so that I can see if our data work out. Anyway, there is a relationship between commitment level and donating time or money to help the poor. So not surprisingly, perhaps in 1999, 50% of the high committed Catholics said you could be a good Catholic without donating time and money. But by 2005, that percentage, while the number of Catholics in that category is lower, that percentage has dropped to 30%. In fact, in 2005, there was less support for the idea of being a good Catholic among any of the three commitment levels. And since the millennials are more likely to be found about the medium and low commitment levels, that probably suggests that over time, regardless of commitment, we will see fewer and fewer Catholics thinking you can be a good Catholic without committing time or money to the poor. In 1999 and again in 2005, we added another question, really overlapping a lot with what David and Brian had to say. We decided to try to probe more deeply the relationship between Catholics and the Church's social teachings seen more broadly. So we selected 5 items that reflect, we thought, a much broader range of these teachings, especially regarding some of the hot-button issues of the time, which, if you pay any attention to today's budget discussions, continue to be hot-button issues. 1, more government funds for health care for poor children. 2, reduced spending on nuclear arms. It's been a big issue, of course, since even before the peace pastoral. 3, more funds for the military. 4, stiffer enforcement of the death penalty. And 5, more cutbacks in welfare programs. My reading, of course, I think you can all figure out from what David and Brian said as to where the bishops are on these issues, supporting, of course, more funds, government funds for the poor in opposing nuclear arms buildups and imposing more money for the military and opposing stiffer enforcement of the death penalty. And, of course, they were adamant in their opposition to further cuts in the welfare program in 1996. Well, we also included before that question another question asking them to rank 12 items of importance to them of these items to their perception of their identity as Catholics, which went all the way from a belief in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, the sacraments, Mary as the Mother of God, and 8 others. And we posed this question, asked questions about how they perceive these as Catholics. Now, helping the poor turned out to be among the top 3 of their sense of identity. This is across all generations. 84% of the national survey identified this as one of the 3 most important ways in which they identify themselves as Catholic. Church involvement in social justice activity, 47%. Notice the drop between those who see being involved in helping the poor as a part of their identity and seeing the church specifically as involved in this activity. It's another sign of the lack of awareness of the 1986 pastoral or even 1983 pastoral. And the church teachings opposing the death penalty, 35%, which also suggests that the church's efforts every year and every 4 years to make these statements on the social responsibility of Catholics as voters to have some impact. Now, this is a large majority saying helping the poor and identifying as Catholics. The same majority, same percentage, said the sacraments were very important and Jesus' life and death, resurrection. So those are the 3 most important ways in which they identified themselves as Catholics. Now, when we came to, Tony, would you turn on the, we came to the 5 items that I had mentioned before on social justice, we asked the question this way. The following are some questions about social and political issues that come before us. Please tell me whether you strongly agree, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree with each of the 5 issues. Now, the point that I want to make clear is that in this question, we did not mention the bishops or the Church's social teachings at all. We had separated the questions so that there would be no obvious link-up in their mind between their identifying themselves as Catholics and this question about the 5 teachings. I'm presenting them. We answered this question for the first time in our 1999 survey, and we've repeated it this year. And I'm showing the data here by commitment level. In other words, those who are high commitment are the Catholics who go to church every Sunday and so forth, and those with low commitment are those who said they hardly ever go to church, the church is not important in their lives, and they might actually leave the church. In case you're just interested in the percentages in each category, for 1999, we had 24% of Catholics in the high commitment. Now we have 21 this time. In the low, it was 17 and 18 both times. Hasn't grown. The middle group contains most Catholics, not too surprising. Now you look at the responses, more federal government funds for health care for the poor, it was for children actually, relating to that piece of legislation, across time, across the commitment level, 71, 74, 74. In 1999, 7 out of 10 Catholics said that that was a very important item for them. Then you go down, reduce spending on nuclear arms. If 1999 you had 48, 51, and 57, half or more Catholics saying yes, they agreed with that, strongly agreed with that. But look what happened in 2005. From 48 down to 35, 51 to 38, we had a significant drop in the percentage of Catholics saying that they agreed with reducing nuclear arms expenditures. Now, the immediate idea is the 2003 and onward war that we're at in Iraq as a possible variable. We can't prove that, but it's interesting that the same thing happens with funds for the military. Catholics generally were supportive of reducing funds, and the percentage agreeing there should be more funds for the military has gone up, not dramatically, but it has gone up in the time period. And again, the immediate explanation might well be the war. Stiffer enforcement of the death penalty. Notice, there's been a lot of debate in the public, goes back into the late 1990s. At that point, the highly committed, almost half, still strongly favored stiffer enforcement of the death penalty. 56 and 61% of the other two. But notice the dramatic drop between 1999 and 2005. Almost a 50% drop among the highly committed. If you think about the period between 1999 and 2005, we had a number of governors who rethought their position on the death penalty. We had a growing number of cases questioning the equal enforcement of the death penalty. We have Sister Helen Prejean making appearances around the country, and of course the bishops and John Paul II. So there may be some impact there, and more cutbacks in welfare program. Again, there's very little support for more cutbacks. And so we do see some relationship here between the bishop's positions and the laity's positions without any evidence that that's why the laity are doing so. But in the face of lack of other variables, it at least shows that the laity are moving somewhat in the same direction, or have been moving, as the bishops. Now, I want to put one more slide up to show you what happens when you look at this question politically. In 2005, for the first time, we asked the American Catholics to identify themselves politically. And the percentage, Republicans 39%, Democrats 42%, Independents 19%. These are pretty close to the figures that Pew and everybody else has been presenting to us over the last 4 or 5 years. Democrats still outnumbering Republicans, but now only by 2 or 3%, and Independents growing to a significant 19%. Notice what the patterns reveal here, that on every one of the questions, the differences between the Democrats and the Republicans are statistically significant. 52-81, 50-30, and so on. and the independents are between the Democrats and the Republicans in all cases. So there's some appearance, at least, that of a continuing alliance of the Democratic Party with a certain part of the Church's social teachings when you're looking at these kinds of issues, and I'll present some data in a moment. When you bring up the issue of abortion, homosexuality, school prayer, you get a different pattern. Now, I want to move on to one last set of data. In this section, I'm going to present some findings from research which a colleague of mine, Steve Tuck of George Washington, and I've been working on for several years. When completed, we expect to be able to compare all key roll call votes in the U.S. House and Senate and all abortion-related votes, whether key or not, for the period beginning 1972 up to the end of the 109th Congress, which is the 05-06 Congress. Our two major controls in the study right now are political party identity and religious affiliation of each member of the House and Senate. Our hypothesis is that over the time period covered, we will find increased roll call voting on the basis of party loyalty, with much less voting to be accounted for by religious affiliation, region of the country, or other variables. In the process, we should be able to draw some conclusions about the degree to which particular religious beliefs and values have been influential in each party's ideologies. We expect the changes to provide some basis for determining the degree of polarization and culture wars in the last 30 years in our Congress. For today, I'm just going to present some data on the data from Network. Catholic Network, of course, makes it rather easy to identify the issues. In case you don't get their bulletins, every year they present a summary of how every member of Congress, House and Senate, has voted on the key issues that they have put forth as key social justice issues. And so all you have to do is be able to go through their list and identify them by their religious affiliation, which is available on other lists from the Congressional Quarterly and Michael Barone's Almanac of American Politics, and you can figure out which of the various religious groups are, how they're voting. Well, notice, now I picked these out. They're issues that the bishops also involve themselves in. Campaign finance reform. Look at these are actual votes, by the way. There was in the 107th Congress, there were 74 Catholic Democrats and 49 Catholic Republicans. So you notice the difference: 73 of 74, 10 of 49 on opposition to tax cuts. The Democrats are almost unanimous, and the Republicans are the other way. Perhaps, to me, one of the more interesting ones here, you expect some of those, is number 5, lifting Cuba sanctions. I'm not sure how many, unless you pay close attention to the bishops, are aware that for many years now the bishops have been urging Congress and the President to remove those sanctions for humanitarian reasons. Well, while it's not as unanimous, 6 out of 7 Catholic Democrats have voted in favor of lifting the sanctions, with Republican Catholics 3 out of 49. And the estate tax repeal, some Democrats weren't quite as enthusiastic, but still 5 out of 7 looks quite different from 1 out of 49. So what I'm suggesting here is that we have a situation in Congress, and I have a dozen tables, whether they're from Catholic Network or from Michael Barone's key issues, they all look the same. Whether you run up the data on just party affiliation or Catholics, you get the same picture. I want to put one other slide up, and that's on the abortion issue as a social justice issue and what's happened to it over time and to the Catholic vote over time. What I've done here, start with I've actually presented a picture of how Catholics, mainline Protestants, and conservative Protestants have voted on the abortion issue beginning in the 96th Congress, which I think was 1980, through the 108th Congress, which was 2004. And what you see is what has happened since 1980. In 1980, this is the Senate votes. The House are practically the same. If I put the House up, you'd see the same pattern. A little less, the House percentage going pro-choice would not be quite as high because the House actually has 1/3 of all Catholic Democrats consistently voting what I would call a consistent life ethic on abortion and all the other issues I've been talking about. But in 80, only 40% of Catholic senators in the Democratic Party voted pro-choice. By the year 2002 or 4, whatever, 108th Congress would be 2004, you see the percentage has gone up to 80%. And it has varied around 80% since the 100th. But notice the pattern for mainline Protestants. It's the same. It started higher, but it started higher for mainline Protestant Democrats and Republicans. And then comes 1980, and the Republican Party formally adopts the position. And what's happened is the mainline Protestant Republicans, all of whose churches have a theology that permits abortion under some conditions, their percentage has dropped from 60% pro-choice down to about 2 or 3%, meaning 1 or 2. Meanwhile, the mainline Protestant Democrats now look very much like the mainline Catholics. And the fourth, which I didn't even want to bother looking at, then I said, let me look at it. Look what's happened since the 100th Congress when Democrats are electing conservative Protestants. They are beginning to vote more pro-choice. Not entirely, but a lot more than they were in the 98th and 100th Congress. This suggests to me that what you have is party trumping religion. Not only on these, I could put up all the issues when you have a 98-2 vote on tax cuts and 298 the other way, you have the same pattern. So what do I conclude from this set of data that we've been gathering? One, American Catholics definitely see helping the poor as a very important part of their identity as Catholics. What that means is, however, not so clear. They do not seem to look to the bishops as leaders in the effort to reach out to the poor, despite the pastorals and the letters that come out from the bishops every year. The majority don't see themselves personally responsible to do something, although that may be changing with these young millennials that Kathleen's been talking about and that we're finding in our data and that my colleague Vince Bolduc has been reporting from his study of Catholic colleges in New England. Whatever their notions about personal responsibility, American Catholics seem to support and oppose the same issues that the bishops support and oppose if we leave aside abortion and other sexual issues. Both political parties, I would say, have ideologies that have, in fact, strong religious roots. I'm not sure that everybody is ready to accept this, but this is how I read it from looking at these data over the past 35 years. These roots are not shallow. I see them as fairly deep. This point is usually overlooked, especially in the previous two elections where most of the writers and pollsters have argued that the Democrats had allowed the Republicans to control the religious variables that divide our society. But I see the Democrats this way. I would argue that their roots go back to at least that point in the early 20th century, 1912 or so, when the mainline and conservative Protestants split over evolution, scientific knowledge, and the interpretation of the gospel. The mainline churches moving to what they called the social gospel, and the conservative churches moving towards the notion of one's personal responsibility. Now, meanwhile, of course, by the 1930s, as David and Brian have reminded us, people like Monsignors Ryan and Higgins and a whole host of other labor-oriented priests and a growing number of people in the Congress, the Catholic social teachings began to manifest themselves in the workings of the Democratic Party. And finally, in more recent years, I didn't put the data up, but Jews have become a more and more significant part of Congress. There are 11 Jewish Democrats and 2 Jewish Republicans in the Senate. Their total percentage in the population is 2.5%. And if you look at where they come from in the country, you begin to understand that it's not that they're Jewish, but that they are representing values and political ideologies that somehow people in their areas, those areas, are tuned into. And we certainly know, if we pay any attention, that Jewish theology has always held a strong tradition that to whom much is given, from them much is expected, and that they have a responsibility to be concerned with the poor. In fact, I would say, I presume that if I knew enough about our own theological roots, they find themselves there. The other major group in Congress that votes as a bloc are the Black Protestants, and they are almost as liberal. In fact, they are just as liberal as the Jews. There are no Black Protestant Republicans in either house of Congress, and haven't been for a number of years. On the Republican side, there seems to me to remain a strong Calvinist tradition of self-responsibility, still found today, for example, in the idea of the entrepreneurial society. There's also a suspicion of government, a belief in limited government, a belief among Catholics who identify now as Republicans, and certainly epitomize in the life of William Simon. I see David had a picture of William Simon, who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury, and who was one of the key spokesmen in the world of business for Michael Novak's statements. I read about William Simon when he died. There was a major obituary, and he took his Catholicism seriously. Every Saturday, he devoted himself to the poor, not only of his immediate community, which was not poor at all, but of the poor in a radius around where he lived in suburban New York. He devoted his life to that consistently. It's a life devoted to serving the poor when you believe that the government is not the agent of the poor. So to the extent, then, the Catholic Church leaders in the U.S. continue to look to the government, especially the federal government, as an agent for social justice on issues like housing, minimum wage, and so forth, the Democratic Party has reflected its teachings constantly since at least 1972, and Catholic Democrats have cast their votes in support of these issues. To the extent to which the term social justice encompasses a more personal responsibility and is found embedded strongly in abortion and other sexual issues, there I think you find that the Republican Party more consistently supports the Church's teachings. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm honored to be a part of the panel, of course, and I'm also honored to be able to follow Father Hare and Professor O'Brien's work. I've read both of their work. In fact, I've abused Professor O'Brien's book, The Collection of Catholic Social Teaching, to the point where Rerum Novarum's almost completely fallen out. And I'm actually going, in a sense, sort of to return to the first discussion to some extent, and perhaps a little bit more critically than Professor O'Brien and Father Hare did. Though I hope, in part, with the same kinds of concerns. It seems like a recurring theme in their presentation, in particular also in their discussion, was the question of the relationship of moral authority to teaching authority, and in particular to the particular kinds of things that are taught in these documents. And to some extent, I think it even dovetails with Professor D'Antonio's, is that right? Did I get that right? Presentation on sort of the longer impact of this kind of document. So as a moral theologian, I'm not a sociologist. I'm sort of interested in looking at, I guess, what we might call sort of the intellectual theological impact of a document like this. And I guess to sort of get to the conclusion, my conclusion would be that the impact has not been very great. And to some extent, even what impact there has been might even be negative. The there's a lot of my presentation I'm going to cut out because it repeats things that were presented in the first presentation, the first two presentations, and also because I want to have a discussion about this kind of issue, because it seems to me that it's very, very important, particularly as we think about sort of how the church in the future is going to be addressing these kinds of issues, the kinds of documents it's going to produce. And you'll see, I'm going to quote Deus Caritas Est, Pope Benedict XVI's, first and only encyclical so far. To some extent, by quoting him, I'm suggesting that I think the emphasis there is to sort of re-angle the Catholic approach magisterially to these kinds of questions. The American Bishop's document, Economic Justice for All, strikes me as a part of a flurry of Catholic documents in the mid to late 80s and early 90s that refocuses Catholic social doctrine on the moral framework of Catholic social analysis. The strength of Catholic contributions to societal reflections on justice is to be found in this moral framework, a framework that emphasizes, as the bishops wrote, service to human dignity through advancement of the family, advancement of human rights, and of special concern for the poorest and weakest among us. This emphasis on the moral framework of Catholic social analysis was amplified by Pope Benedict in Deus Caritas Est, and this is from, I think it's number 28A, and I'm going to read the whole paragraph. Pope Benedict writes, "The Church's social teaching argues on the basis of reason and natural law," and this is interesting, right, because you're moving away to some extent from, the emphasis on Scripture and a kind of patristic approach that Father Hare was describing that's seen in the Economic Pastoral. It argues on the basis of reason and natural law, namely on the basis of what is in accord with the nature of every human being. It recognizes that it is not the Church's responsibility to make this teaching prevail in political life. Rather, the Church wishes to help form consciences in political life and to stimulate greater insight into the authentic requirements of justice, as well as greater readiness to act accordingly, even when this might involve conflict with situations of personal interest. Building a just social and civil order, wherein each person receives what is his or her due, is an essential task which every generation must take up anew. And that's something he dwells on quite a bit in the second part of that encyclical, the notion that this is an essential part of faithfulness, this kind of social justice task, which is, again, something that was emphasized in the first two presentations. As a political task, however, this cannot be the Church's immediate responsibility. Yet, since it is also a most important human responsibility, the Church is duty-bound to offer, through the purification of reason and through ethical formation, her own specific contribution towards understanding the requirements of justice and achieving them politically. This is me now. The alternative to an emphasis on the moral framework of social analysis was and remains too great an emphasis on particular policy proposals for instantiating justice in any particular society. These proposals, while well-intentioned and necessary as elements of good politics, become divisive and quickly dated when elements of either papal or episcopal teaching. Additionally, the proposals can seem quaint and even misguided from the point of view of the philosophical or scientific specialists who deal in the areas towards which such proposals are directed. The strongest parts of economic justice for all, then, remain those that attempt to cull from scriptural and traditional analysis further support for the abiding principles of Catholic social doctrine, including among those principles support for human dignity, preservation and advancement of the common good, the preferential option for the poor, and the universality and interconnectedness of the human family. These and other principles foster the purification of reason, as Pope Benedict puts it, that can steer public analysis away from individual or parochial interests towards increasingly expansive goods more genuinely in service of all. As the bishop's document states, the challenge, though, is not merely to think differently, but also to act differently. Purification of reason, which we might call education of conscience, will express itself then in the application of these principles in the daily lives of those who embrace them and those they meet. On the other hand, in terms of assessing and criticizing the document, its strengths seem enervated by a policy specificity that played into an ideological divide in the Church and the wider culture. As most know, the document was criticized, and this was also discussed in the first presentations and also even in the handout. The document was criticized from the right and from the left by those who found it too focused on wealth distribution at the expense of wealth creation, and by those who found it not radical enough, too beholden to capitalist patterns of thinking and acting, and insufficiently attentive to alternative analyses of power and economics. The divide between these criticisms seems bridged by a united conviction from both the right and the left, at least in terms of the critics, that the document was too materialistic, as Charles Curran suggests. This is in an essay of his that's collected in the Himes book on Catholic social teaching. That is, the bulk of the letter's 100 pages, and that's also a sort of knock on the letter, right, as well as its length, engage specific economic proposals in the areas, as we know, of unemployment, of poverty, food and agriculture, and the U.S. role in the global economy, that ultimately drown out the spiritual aspects of the moral principles in the bishop's message. Again, what results is a focus on the proposals to the detriment of the moral framework. In consequence, the framework suffers neglect, or is even consciously rejected because of one's disagreement with a proposal. It is awfully illustrative of the document's emphasis that its passages on the scriptural and traditional understanding of love and justice is a mere 2 pages and makes no reference to Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. Indeed, one could make the case, and this is a case suggested by Curran again, that the document fails to discuss the virtues of the just person at all. Indeed, despite its coming out of the tradition inaugurated by Rerum Novarum, it's striking about this document that it dwelt hardly at all upon the human person as the subject of economic activity. Yes, the document repeatedly leans on the principle of human dignity, but it does so without describing human dignity in any depth. And as everyone is aware, human dignity has been appealed to by everyone to justify just about everything. The document rightly draws on a tradition of analysis emphasizing the manifold nature of the human being, a nature that cannot be satisfied by mere societal change, as neat as that might be. Unfortunately, however, too often the document gives that impression, this materialistic impression, by focusing so intently and specifically on policy proposals. It thus enters into a framework of analysis not necessarily connected to its theological analysis. And this, to me, is sort of the fundamental critique of the document, is that it reads almost like it's 3 separate documents. And even sort of hearing, as people have probably read, the descriptions of the formulation of the document, it almost sounds as though it happened that way. You have a kind of biblical account, you have a kind of moral framework, and then you have policy proposals, and even to some extent within the policy proposals, you get the bishops, the Midwest bishops stuffing in, the agricultural concerns. So the document, to my mind, doesn't read as integrated sufficiently. By entering into economic and social analysis and adopting particular perspectives, like, for instance, dependency theory, the document can't help but alienate those opposed to those kinds of analysis, and even those specialists who might find that analysis inadequate or even cute. In other words, the social analysis always comes with the risk of undermining what ought to be primary, which is the moral analysis. One can't help but feel at times the document proceeds along a path set primarily by economists rather than that charted by theologians. If the document followed the path of the latter, wouldn't there have been a rich analysis of desire that connected the desire for wealth, its creation, its distribution, and its consumption, and its inevitable frustration with the desire for God? Wouldn't such a focus reorient our vision regarding all that is social and all those social tasks that we face? In other words, one of the things that I was concerned about in the document, and I think in terms of responding to Father Hare and Professor O'Brien's presentations, is that you see the document sort of emerge as a kind of a series of responses to particular policy questions that animate the document, and it's not clear, I guess, in other words, the connection of the theological analyses to these. On the one hand, we get a better kind of scriptural analysis than we've seen in the past, and we rightly can criticize papal documents for being proof texts, in certain points. On the other hand, it's not clear which is driving which, why the biblical analysis, the particular kind of biblical analysis, is spelling itself out in specific policy proposals. What it seems to do, and this seems like a kind of sociological problem, maybe that's even confirmed to some extent by some of the data we've seen presented, is it sort of permits Catholics to continue to be divided, and rather than reuniting over these kinds of issues, but to continue to be divided by their particular attachment to proposals, rather than being called out of those proposals to a kind of broader moral vision, a broader moral framework, that will challenge, any of the proposals they have as it's addressed to them more particularly. One thing that I think is, and again, sort of illustrative of this problem is that 10 years after this document is produced, the bishops produce a kind of follow-up to the document. I don't know if anybody's seen that or not, but it's a much more condensed document. It's a document that dwells in particular on the principles. It has a kind of punch to it, it seems to me, that this document lacks, in part because of its sort of overwhelmingly large nature. It's hard to understand, or even hard to fathom, why we would expect lay people to be animated by a document of this sort. I teach it in my classes. It's the one document that continues out of O'Brien's book that continues to be the one that seminarians almost uniformly dislike. It's just it's too much. It's too specific in certain points. It turns them off, and they immediately sort of draw these kinds of conclusions about the relationship of the teaching authority on the specific proposals to the moral authority of the bishops. So when we talked, for instance, earlier about why has the moral authority of the bishops sort of been weakened in the past, and people rightly point to the scandal, the sexual scandal, as being a significant factor in this. But I wonder to what extent even documents like this contribute to that kind of diminishment of moral authority, of teaching authority of the episcopacy. Anyway, again, I offer those for suggestions for hopefully us to discuss. Thank you very much.
Well, we have about 15 minutes, which is plenty of time if you ask good, succinct questions quickly. So I would now open the floor. I think David O'Brien and Father Hare may also want to participate, perhaps from the places where they are now, since there aren't enough seats up here. But you could direct your questions to anyone you like. Oh, do we? Oh, well, okay, the letter of the law. Well, at any rate, are there, Dean?
I'd like to hear a discussion of whether the specificity of this document was a good thing or a bad thing. There are different views on this. One person says it damaged moral authority of bishops, and others, I'm sure, would argue, finally got concrete enough so that people pay attention. But where are we on this?
I just these raised the question, and we have one of the questions in our 4 volumes that we have pursued over the 4 has to do with the teaching, the moral authority of the bishops, and now it is focused entirely on the sexual issues because those in 1987 had emerged and they have continued, and we have found a decreasing acceptance of the authority of the bishops on each of these issues, whether you control for generation or male, female, or whatever, going back to 1987. It's been consistent, and that precedes the scandal of 2002 by 20 years, by 18, 15 years, whatever it is. And so we do have some evidence that the moral authority wasn't suddenly shattered in 2002, but it had been suffering from at least 1987. That's
I would like to ask regard to the students as well as the Michael Novak crowd. Go back to when Mater Magista came out and the attack on it by Buckley's editor. Mother yes, teacher no. I'd like to know, are these seminarians that you are teaching, are they coming from a kind of ideological framework themselves, as Novak and Buckley and those people came? I'm reminded of Pius XI's cry when he put out the letter on communism. They went for that hog wild, but when it came to Rem Novarum, they got up and walked in the church. So I think that when you talk about the bishops being that specific, you've got to talk about what ideological framework those folks are coming from. And very specifically, if they didn't get the principles or buy the principles back at the turn of the other century and by 31, are they still not getting the principles and buying them? And so did the bishops try to provoke in both of these letters, particularly the one economics, say, you know, we've been saying this for years, these are some practical things you can do with these principles.
I'm not a sociologist, but you know, I'm observant enough, you know, to see my, you know, what my students are like. There's no, I mean, there's increasing ideological uniformity, it seems to me, over the past couple of years, but there was no uniformity when I first arrived. And I mean, there isn't uniformity now, but there's more. And they came ideologically from very, very different perspectives. One of the things that I'm sure you know, one of the things that animates some of these students is the sort of, you know, the papacy of John Paul II. And maybe this relates to the sort of millenarian, or whatever you call it, millennial. Sorry, not the millenarians. The millennials. The Freudian slip, right? The millennial, you know, youth that you see, and they are, I mean, obviously sort of animated by that kind of, you know, the charisma of the Pope, you know, his commitment to certain kinds of things. But on the other hand, too, there are, you know, more than, you know, enough of those you might call, you know, on the left among the seminarians. So, but they all find the document, and their reaction to the document itself seem uniform to me, which is to sort of focus on the policy. It's almost like they read the center of the document, and the last, you know, bit and the first bit falls out. You know, the stuff on Scripture, and the end, the stuff on the sort of spiritual aspect of all this teaching. It just drops off, and then you have a kind of discussion about, well, what are these policies? Why are we talking about farm subsidies? You know, what is this? Again, you know, there's an enormous demographic difference between you know, Professor O'Brien and me, or Father Hare and me, you know, in terms of our approach to these issues as well. So there's no uniformity except in their response to the document, which is to see it as polarizing, as confirming of, you know, particulars of their positions that they already held, and also suspicions that they have about people on the other side, which is that they'll sort of take or leave, you know, certain aspects of church teaching based on prior commitments. Nobody is reading the bookend parts of the document and being transformed, to my experience in the classroom.
I'd love to hear Father Brian frame, because I want to weigh in on this, but I want to hear him first, because I've heard him so eloquently answer this question about specificity many times over the years. Could you just say a word to his argument about
a couple of things. My first point is to build Antonio. The idea that this generation is going to remember a document from 1984 in 1994, chances are 5%.
Right.
I mean, they don't remember. I mean, ask them about George Kennan's article, or ask them about it. That's just. I mean, I wouldn't even ask that question. I mean, it just is not going to happen in this generation. They're reading off the email. They're reading off. Now, somebody says, well, you know, they read Thomas Aquinas. Well, they are, because they get assigned it in class, and they read it. But, I mean, if you ask Catholics generally about the Tertia Pars of the Summa, I mean, they're not going to get very many that remember it. So, I mean, I think that's just a given. I'm not surprised that somebody doesn't remember a document in 1995 when they were in grammar school, unless they've been taught it exclusively. Secondly, there always is a place to just teach the principles. There's always a place to do that. There's also a place to write policy documents. The Bishop's Statement of 1919 was a policy document. The New Deal was reflected in that document. Now, that is not all of Catholic social teaching, but it is the document of 1919. And I would argue that part of what Catholic moral theology is about casuistry. We certainly don't retreat from specificity when we get into nutrition and hydration. But nutrition and hydration are not purely moral principles. They're combined with medical analysis. So, I mean, I wouldn't marry the argument that you have to be specific. I would defend very specifically the ability to be specific if you acknowledge the principle that increasing specificity means declining moral authority. So it is one thing to say that you cannot directly, intentionally, purposely kill non-combatants. Actually, I think Catholics understand that today in a way they didn't understand it in 1944 when John Ford wrote. It is a second thing to say that if you're targeting missiles embedded in concrete on the edge of Moscow, which is what the debate was about, you better be specific or nobody's going to know what you're talking about. Nobody. So my view is there's a place for policy documents and there's a place for principles. But don't think that you can write a policy document, which what this was intended to be, policy ethics. Don't think you can write that and stay at the level of generality. I mean, I worked in this city for 20-something years. That document was partly aimed at this city. They will wipe you off the map if you stay at the level of metaphysical principle. It just won't happen. So it's a choice about what you choose to do, but just don't confuse the literary genre. And John Paul II was not embarrassed to get to the particulars. I mean, his lecture to George Bush on the Gulf, on the Iraq War, if that is not specificity, I've never seen it. So, and I could cite you text after text about that. But it's a matter of choice. But I mean, the point is, don't expect them to remember, Bill.
But in terms of I mean, you said, they will wipe you off the map, or something
Right.
like that. So the primary audience of this policy document then is Congress,
It is a primary audience, absolutely.
But it's
Absolutely. That's why we engaged the Defense Department in concrete, detailed
Right.
discussion. That was not meant to be a waste of time. The Secretary of Defense and members of Congress, absolutely. If you're going to write a document like this, you better be ready to go into the arena, or else don't write it. Write a commentary on St. Thomas's Secunda Secundi, which is a very valuable, useful thing to do. Just don't expect anybody last year to remember that they've said anything about it. Just don't expect it to happen.
This is really useful to me. I like these kinds of conversations. I just want to make 2 points. One, in reference to Pat, your comment about seminarians and what their framework is. Katarina Schutt up at the University of St. Thomas. Katarina Schutt up in Minnesota has been studying the seminarians for ages and can give you some good data on. They're different than the lay people. They are more conservative than lay people. So I think some of this, we're going to see some growing concerns as that plays out, and lots of good data on that I think I'd be happy to refer you to. The other thing is that some of this is part of the larger culture. Again, Pew has done some really fascinating national studies, and over a 10-year period, 1995 to 2005, about 50% of all believers say the church has a right to get involved in the large arena. 45% are saying, no, they don't, whether you're Catholic, Jewish, whatever. So there's a larger issue here about what we think our institutions of religion ought to be doing about the political arena. And I think we've got a national split that suggests we're going to have some challenges internally as well.
I want to come back to the data and a little later because about something else, but just on the specificity question, and as Brian has exchanged, I think I have some sympathy with this in retrospect, and even more if you take the peace pastoral, because the peace pastoral, your problem is much more sharply defined. That is, you have the part one with scriptural and theological discussion, itself schizophrenic in a way, but it's there. But then you have the middle sections on policy, which are not theological religious discussions. I mean, they are very much philosophically grounded, but they're about policy, and they end up with a strictly conditioned moral acceptance and deterrence. And we had lots of arguments about that, but in a sense they weren't religious arguments. They were political and philosophical kind of arguments. They weren't really religious. And we had to bring into those arguments our understanding of international policy and all kinds of stuff. And then in part four, of course, they go back to it. So there's a real kind of schizophrenic piece. And your argument is really about what's going on in number two. And Father Harris explained what they were doing in number two, and you said, well, in fact, that at that moment, that was a very necessary thing perhaps for them to do. But there is a kind of split there that I think is real. Now, I would suggest that if you took the whole package of that letter and rethought it in terms of peacemaking, that is, in terms of the active obligation to be a peacemaker, then I think we'd be on the way to solving this problem. There's another problem about lay experience, but it seems to me that the discussion emerging from the Catholic Peace Building Network is that as people, as human beings, and as Christians, you have this obligation in these situations of violence and conflict and the danger of war to find ways to make peace, to create conditions in which something will happen, the nonviolent resolution of conflict, various virtues. And in that constructive process, that's at the point at which you have to enter into this political and civil discourse, and there's an autonomy to that. That's what I think Higgins was getting at in that piece about the autonomy of the laity, the autonomy of the secular. If we could bring that kind of approach to it, more emphasis on the active peacemaking, which is a universal obligation, and away from the way it was framed in the letter, I think we'd be better off. Same thing, I think, with justice seeking. That there's this active process, and the church has a teaching, kind of pastoral / teaching responsibility in the formation of us for that vocation. But the vocation is not war avoidance. The vocation is peacemaking. I don't know if that would help, but I think there's a way, when we get this thing down in a kind of non-ideological kind of discussion, we read the Benedict 15, we read these things, I think there's a way out of this. But I don't know.
No, it does. I mean, I sort of remain concerned to some extent. Like, and I don't know Novak's particular critique. That you both alluded to. The notion that to some extent you seem to say it was sort of disingenuous, that he was appealing to the laity, or wasn't quite, didn't apply. Let's put it that way. Some notion of laity, to make it sort of, it was too clerical. This document, the economics document. Spell it out a little bit more.
But his laity were all on Wall Street, so I mean.
But to the extent that the document is aiming to sort of is striving to be a policy document and is striving to have as a primary audience, Congress, it strikes me then that you're sort of risking losing the impact of the document on the laity. You're risking sort of talking over the heads of the laity. You're risking all of this stuff, which it seems to me, is maybe expressing itself in, the loss of moral authority. The episcopacy's loss of moral authority. And that's, look, that may be a risk you judge worth taking, but it seems like this is the kind of thing precisely that might drive people to a more, or kind of less enthusiasm for an Americanist Catholic approach. If Americanism means that our bishops are speaking to policymakers, rather than to us clearly, to go back, to make the point, again, Father Hare's 2 or 3 examples of specificity were all about intentional killing of the innocent. Okay, they weren't about other kinds of policy specificity, and that's something that the Church at least maintains, that it's continued to be specific about sort of since the beginning, and will be specific about since the beginning. And if that kind of policy specificity is going to be elided into specificity about farm subsidies, then it seems to me you're going to confuse the laity about which of these kinds of things really bears moral authority as a specific teaching. Oh, it is, the teaching about, not blowing up Moscow, of the same kind as we need more farm subsidies. It is the teaching on capital punishment of the same kind. It just seems to me
Whoever said it was.
Well,
I mean, that's my point. You read through those documents, and those distinctions are made all the way down the line. We do not specify. And by the way, read John Ford in 1944, if you want to be specific.
I've read John Ford.
All right.
With regard to the just wage again?
Right.
Oh, the bond. Yeah, sure. No, but right. But my point is, if you're going to say, okay, look, we've been specific all along. Look how specific we are with regard to nutrition and hydration, or not blowing up, not targeting innocent people. So therefore, we can be specific with these other issues, right? Clearly, the Church is maintaining that a specificity on not bombing innocent people or on nutrition and hydration is of a different kind and of a different kind of authority than the other one. And it seems to me that one of the things we seem to be seeing, and again, I'm no sociologist, is that the lady's confused about that, or maybe willingly so, about the authority of these kinds of teaching.
I must confess, first of all, I don't think bishops risk talking over the heads of the American Catholic public, to be very honest. The American Catholic public now, the median level of education and degree of sophistication, the danger we face is talking beneath them. That's the danger. Because they're all over universities, they're all over government, they're all over business. The danger we face is not addressing the issues they face each day. And bishops lose moral authority when they don't speak, as well as when they do speak. And the chance that you're going to fail morally by not addressing the issues of the day that people deal with every day, in the military, in the government, in business, is much higher, I think. Now, they disagree. That's the point about a sliding scale. I don't expect everybody to agree with the fact that you move from an argument about the universal destination of the goods of creation to farm subsidies. I do agree farm subsidies, or maybe not so much farm subsidies, but today, for example, the debate about farm subsidies in industrialized countries and the impact that has on the markets of developing countries is a serious moral question of the first order. And I see no reason for the Catholic Church to be mute in the middle of that discussion if it has empirical evidence, good analysis, and moral principle. And being shoved to the sidelines because you're afraid you're going to be misunderstood, it seems to me, lacks a fundamental virtue called courage, as well as intelligence. I must confess, I have very little sympathy for silent bishops, lest they sacrifice their moral authority.
I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and add my 1.5 cents worth. It would seem to me that the great moments in Catholic social teaching in this country have all been shrouded in specificity. There's this specificity wage in John Ryan's telling. There are the particulars of the 1919 bishop's statement, which does in fact bear fruit in the 1930s. And similarly, I think one of the reasons that both the peace pastoral and the economics pastoral in the 1980s got so much attention, and they did, is that they combined an effort to state timeless principles with specificity that spoke to the politics of the moment. What it would suggest to me, it seems, is that it's an ongoing project. And just as your students would not find John Ryan's particulars in the living wage terribly relevant, and they might disagree with aspects of it, then it's the task of the next generation to keep the project going with specifics, actually, so people can relate. Yes.
You brought that up. I already had a question for the panel on a similar topic here. I thank you. It was specifically the question of seminarians and social justice, not specifically on that document. The bringing together your observation, Dr. Shu's observation about seminarians being generally looking at things a little more conservatively than the Catholic general public. I'm wondering whether you think that that might just be a symptom or a cover, those specific complaints about that, a symptom or a cover for a general distaste or rejection of more of the Catholic social teaching on the part of seminarians rather than that specific one. I come from and observed a seminary where the course on Catholic social teaching, which used to be a lecture and discussions course, had to be changed to a lecture-only course because of seminarian objection to Catholic social teaching. So the situation that you bring up sounds very similar.
No, my students are able and they discuss the things well. I mean, I really couldn't speak to their motivations. You know, I mean, again, maybe to some extent that's more a question for the sociologists. And I mean, we'd have to sort of understand to what extent they're devoting themselves to social justice in other ways. I mean, the fact I don't want us. I mean, goodness, I hope we don't start dismissing people's disagreement with any particular document as symptomatic of prior ideological commitment or something like that from either side. I mean, again, this just strikes me as part of what's dangerous about these kinds of things. These people know, this document gets received and interpreted through particular approaches that laud its methodological approach. That it was consultative, that it was exhaustive. I mean, it was empirical. All good things. But that kind of analysis is often coupled with. But on the other hand, there are these other kinds of documents out there that don't do this. And therefore, the implication is they're deficient teaching documents. It seems that that's what happens with this kind of document. And maybe again, it's just expressing a sort of division between where, for instance, Professor O'Brien, is coming at the document from, having been there, et cetera, and where I'm coming from the document, as somebody who's simply studying it. But the division doesn't seem to have been at all addressed by these kinds of documents, but instead sort of exacerbated. So I don't know. My seminarians seem like good guys to me, who just happen to disagree with, and be animated, in their disagreement with. Or not even a disagreement, with a distaste for the document. The first complaint is it's too long. The second complaint is it's too specific, and so on. And the lack of integration, And I don't mean to be. I agree with those criticisms. I don't want to, make it seem like I'm, the seminarians of the problem here. I agree with those criticisms, and make of me what you will.
I would like to weigh in on seminarians. I'm Tony Pogorels from Theological College. And I've been here for 5 years, and I have seen an increase in the interest of our seminarians over the last 5 years. We have 1/10 of our population.
In Catholic social teaching? Interest in Catholic social teaching.
Interest in Catholic social teaching and interest in social justice.
Yeah.
We have 1/10 of our seminarians signed up to go to something at the Catholic Ministry Gathering over the next few days. I see, when we have talks, a significant portion of the house, maybe a third of our house, which is, seminarian-wise, about 65 people, coming to things. And this is greater than it was. I mean, I'm very interested in finding out that our seminarians go to things like, the protest against the war. I was at the first one a couple of years ago, and I was astounded to run into some of our seminarians. So, I mean, it's a certain group. But, I mean, it's, a significant enough a number that, you would see it. And so, I mean, you would see a variety of positions in your own classes, I'm sure. And I don't know many students who don't complain about long, lengthy documents. So, I mean, that's kind of part of the course.
Could I change the subject a little bit, go back to Bill's data? Bill, the most important data in recent discussion about religious people in America was Karl Rove's discovery from John Cream and others that those who go to church most often, in any tradition, are very much more apt to vote Republican. Is that, I mean, that was really big data, right? And it's held true right through 2004, I think. Is that? Could you tell? So, I mean, I just heard language about good Catholics. Was that good Catholics vote Republican and bad Catholics like me?
No. As a matter of fact, our data show a larger percentage of the Catholics in our population are Democrats than Republicans. 36, whatever the percentage was.
So you're
a
running
higher
against
percentage of those who identified as Catholic and identified as party were Democrats rather than Republicans. And when we ran the data on issues, I mean, if you run the issues which we have, abortion and homosexuality, same-sex marriage, divorce and remarriage without an annulment, there is no doubt that the Republican Catholics line up and the Democratic Catholics don't. But the Democratic Catholics go to Mass as frequently as the Republican Catholics do. We do not get the same data that they have been showing. Now, in so many ways our samples fit. Our samples fit. They're consistent with the earlier samples. So, the first time we've asked a question, so we don't have a trend. But what I can say is that certainly, as it showed there, the Democratic Catholics line up overwhelmingly for these social issues. The Republican Catholics lined up overwhelmingly against abortion, and against same-sex marriage, and the other sexual issues. But what is also true is that the Democrats have a lower level of party loyalty, especially in the House. You have a consistent 1/3 of the Catholics in the House who vote what I would call the Bernardine life ethic. They're voting all the way on those issues. You do not see anywhere in the Republican vote on any of these issues anywhere like 20% supporting the church's teachings beyond their opposition to abortion. You don't have a crossover. So the Democrats have been consistent in that, and that's why I showed the picture. That's why you never get above 67 or 68% supporting a pro-choice position. Now, those Catholics primarily come from Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. You can identify them. And they come from Catholic districts where they run on a anti-abortion position. Right. But they also run in position, and the bishops, I think, have an easier time there, at least they, except, since we're talking, Stupak from Michigan was about to be introduced to one of the bishops, and the bishop says he's a Democrat, I don't want to talk to him. And Stupak said, the son of so-and-so, he doesn't even know what my votes are. In other words, if there's a problem, and maybe Brian touched on it there when he said that there's a tendency to underestimate the laity, here is a member of Congress who has consistently voted the issues from abortion along, and this bishop doesn't even know who he is. It doesn't assume, or at least be negative, or be neutral and say, oh, I'm pleased to meet you, and then find out. Right.
Yes. Well, from the point of view of an ignorant medievalist, it's been maybe 50 years, not 60, but maybe 50 years since I read Rare of Navarro. But I seem to remember that it says something about the right of labor to organize. Is that right? I'm reading the answer. It is true, isn't it? Yes. Which seems to me specific. And I'm just wondering whether the Friends of Michael Novak, who runs seminars on how to break unions, whether we think that the bishops ought to say something about this moral principle, the right to organize and the right to oppose people who devote their lives to breaking unions.
I would want to defend Michael. Michael has been a dialogue partner of mine for 35 years, and he's a bright, capable guy.
But the people who support Michael Novak are, in fact, doing that.
But that doesn't surprise me. The notion that we're going to create...
Let me retract my red herring. I'm still worried about the right.
Well, maybe. But there are 65 million Catholics in the United States. We are not going to create around them a policy platform. That was the old model of the Christian Democratic Party. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen in a highly educated, highly pluralistic, secular society. What you want them all doing is talking about the issues. Talking about the issues.
Well, what about organizing labor?
I think the church ought to be out there defending the organization of labor, and I know a lot of CEOs that are never going to go along with it. But they're not going to go to hell because of that. I'd like to see Catholics join in the issues.
Will they go to hell for voting pro-choice in the Senate?
Well, they won't. I don't think myself.
In terms of specificity, is it possible to? And I don't know Novak or the people you're talking to.
I'm sorry, I said Novak.
No, but okay. I support the right to organize labor, and I'm not familiar with many people who are Catholic and who study and read these documents who don't. But is it possible, though, to support the right of labor to organize, and in particular to support the right of this particular union to organize in that one, but also to say to that union, you no longer are serving the public good, and to oppose it, right? And doesn't it seem like that there may be specific cases where you're going to be opposing certain kinds of unions or asking for significant reform of certain kinds of labor organization, while you're saying, of course I support the right to organize labor, but in this case, if this particular union is contrary to that and to the good.
George Higgins would say, absolutely, yes, it's what he did with the Teamsters out in the Salinas Valley.
So so at least in terms of there's already then a difference in specificity, right? One might say, yes, this is a principle. Labor has the right to organize, but you may say in a particular case, not here or not in this way, or something like that.
What I'm saying is that the right to organize itself is being attacked. I'm not talking about
I don't deny
Teamsters and Salinas Valley. I'm talking about the general thrust of and the decline in membership in labor unions certainly reflects the success of this general. This is a campaign, a conspiracy.
If I
it's part of globalization, and again, that's an issue that no one has.
If I recall correctly, too, it was during Clinton's administration, right, where you had the repeal of whatever that law where you had the right to strike, the right to strike law, right? Wasn't it the right to strike law where you could strike and not worry about losing your job? And I think that was repealed.
The air traffic controls.
Well, that was Reagan. No, that's later. I'm talking about earlier. Earlier. Excuse me. Clinton is later, obviously. I'm talking about this particular legislation that I thought was repealed during his administration. So I agree, but it seems to me that's a cross-party attack. Maybe it's a business.
We had an interesting dissertation, though, last year from one of our students here about resistance to labor organization in the Catholic healthcare culture, which raised a whole set of other issues.
I just wanted to make a comment. I'm just sort of hearing a generational difference, really, and that whether you're on the left or the right.
I'm older than I look.
Whether you're on the left or the right, it sort of plays into the not looking at an institutional thing. They don't want to be told what to do. If they want to come to it themselves, it's going to be part of themselves and not imposed from outside. I was just a comment.
Can I just extend that for 1/2 second and say that again, that spirituality study, I think, says it. You can't pigeonhole them. They're on this side, all those issues. They're mushing. They're pulling back and forth to get a sense of the world that they want to be able to be part of. So I think we do have to watch that.
Yes, exactly.
I sort of am like a voice from the wilderness of just average Catholic laity, and also generationally of that sort of 60s generation that have gotten gray hair now, white hair. But I want to agree with Dr. Capizzi, or at least get on his side a little bit. In regard to some of these documents, as my generation, I participated in some groups and parishes, reading groups where we've actually looked at this document again just recently and had the same problems Dr. Capizzi is discussing. Not that it's not well-intentioned and not even an issue of its specificity, except to the extent that it seemed very secular and we did not know what we could gain from it as a Catholic viewpoint on these things. And that's what seemed to be missing. I think Dr. Capizzi kind of alluded to. It did not seem to have the more general, provide a more general spiritual framework. For example, virtue in the individual, giving rise to certain attitudes on social, secular, ethical issues. Instead, it just seemed like another good but ethically generic document, ethically neutral, in the sense of just not having a Catholic viewpoint, a Catholic framework, and so it seemed kind of empty and consequently dated. I think the specificity comes to be dating it, which is natural because the document is going to address contemporary issues. But I guess what I'm saying, and I think that's what inspired all of us by John Paul II, was that he seemed to bring a sort of dynamic spiritual framework to contemporary secular issues that we're all involved in, that a lot of times we don't see, at least I don't personally, from the American bishops. and American bishop documents. And so, you know, like I said, I'm just sort of maybe siding a little bit, or what I understand Dr. Capisi can frame it, you all can frame it better than I can express it. But there is a problem there, and it's a problem that left a lot of my generation sort of permanently, to use a very 60s term, turned off. And not for the reason that the church wasn't go-go, it wasn't hip enough. It was that it was too hip. It was so hip it left behind its traditional Catholic values and just became another hip sort of, we're in with everybody else on these issues like nuclear policy, human dignity, etc., which we all are. But when we sat down and read that document, trying to look for, because we all can read the newspaper and watch NPR, etc., where you get the mainstream sort of good old-fashioned American values on these matters. But we weren't getting what we were looking for, not Catholic in a narrow sense, but Catholic in an informative and enlightening sense. So I just offer that comment from a different generation entirely from Dr. Capisi, no matter how old he looks.
Well, it's my generation too, but I'm also a historian, and I do want to remind you that ultimately this pastoral has to be taken in context. And in the 1980s, I must tell you that it did not seem to be the American consensus that there was anything wrong with nuclear weapons or their first strike use. So in that context, this came as a blessing. I mean, it's the product of a committee, and it has multiple audiences, so we'll never achieve the eloquence of one of JP2's encyclicals. But at the time, the impact was just enormous, I think, for many Catholics. And it seemed authentically Catholic in that sense.
Just a quick comment, focusing not so much on the question of specificity, but on the dated character of these documents that they take on over time. I couldn't help noticing that both Joe and Dave remarked in separate contexts on the power of the 10-year after follow-up documents, the Harvest of Justice and Sown in Peace. And I think that's significant because if you're going to have specificity and if you're going to speak not just to the faithful, but the persons of good faith, including in the D.C. Policy community, then once you start that, that's a process that has to be updated somehow. And I think several people have pointed out that it's the lack of continuity there that's the problem, not so much the fact that the church has spoken to these issues at that level of specificity in the first place.
And I mean, just in context again, the economics pastoral came out shortly after the end of the worst recession since the 1930s. So again, in that climate, what you saw on television every night was horrendous. And that gave it a kind of resonance that inevitably it lacks years and years afterwards. I think we are now...
Can I tell a funny story?
Great way to end.
I don't know, it'd be funny for those of us that are older, but some of you here don't know who Monsignor Higgins was, but he was an amazing human being, and he was very smart, and he, of course, had been known as a labor priest. And one of the things you were working off in those days was that so many of our bishops came from working class backgrounds. So one of the big moments in this process of the economics pastoral was the demand by a number of Catholic chief executive officers who wanted to meet with Weakland and high-ranking bishops. So they had this big meeting in New Jersey in a private place, and only big bishops could come. So Weakland had to go with Cardinal Bernardine and I guess Cardinal O'Connor and some others, and he was told he couldn't bring staff. Bernardine said, well, we're not coming without staff, and he insisted that he bring Higgins and young Cretenmeyer, who was the staff person for it. So Ron described this to me, and this is the right of labor to organize. This conversation went back and forth between the bishops and Jack Welch and a whole group of these very powerful figures, and George was sitting kind of off to the side. And at one point, George leaned over and said something to Bernardine, and the next time there was a pause in the conversation, Bernardine asked whether Monsignor Higgins might have something he'd like to say. And Ron said, you always knew he had something to say important when he got up and he pushed his chair in, and he stood kind of holding onto the back of the chair. And he began saying how much he had benefited from this dialogue today and how he likes to sample the business literature, and he was really very respectful of the many complicated kind of issues that business leaders had to deal with. And he said, and as I read the business literature these days, and I've seen some of you quoted in there, I understand you have a problem these days with labor unions. Is that right? Well, it was like, he said, it was like throwing red meat. They all immediately began quite passionately to tell how much they disliked trade unionism and labor unions and the rest, which of course played right into the bishops, who of course have had one of their bottom lines was support for labor organizing. So they came out of the meeting even more strongly committed to their pastoral perhaps than when they went in. But I thought that was a really good
Of course, when John A. Ryan was writing, most of those labor unionists or incipient labor unionists were Catholics, and the big bosses were Protestants.
Right,
and
right.
in a way, it made his life a lot easier. I mean, I suppose one of the most admirable things about the bishops in the 1980s is taking on the project when the CEOs are probably more likely to be Catholic than the heads of labor unions, and when the average Catholic is very well off indeed. So they were on a new project in a way, and I think it does need updating. So on that note, thank you for coming. And there are
Remember next week, on the 15th, February 15th, Thursday, 4 o'clock, we'll have a discussion on asset building and Catholic Social Fund. And Chris Billis Center, room 321. Thank you.